My sister Lauren walked into the office I managed at the Somerset Heights and tossed a letter onto my table. It was a rent increase notice, tripling my monthly payment from $4,200 to $12,800. My parents, Robert and Susan, stood by and called it fair market value. They called it business. What they didn't know was that 3 years ago, before she passed, Grandma Evelyn had me sign the final ownership papers. Beneath my skin was the memory of that ink. I already owned the entire building. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I did not cry. I did not ask why. I did not even look up from the letter to meet their eyes. Instead, I focused on the fine grain of the oak table, the one I had personally restored when the humidity of a Boston winter threatened to warp the wood. In that moment, anger was not a loud, crashing wave, it was clinical. It was a cold, sharp blade of clarity. I have spent 6 years being the ghost in these historic walls. While Lauren was at her high-rise law firm building her reputation, I was in the basement of the Somerset Heights, literally holding the foundation together. I am a conservation engineer, but to my family, I was just the glorified janitor who lived in the unit by the laundry room. I looked at Lauren's designer heels and thought about the ink beneath my fingernails. For 3 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family. When the historic masonry started to crumble, and the city threatened a lien, I did not ask my parents for a dime. I knew they were too busy spending Grandma Evelyn's leftover dividends on Mediterranean cruises and golf club memberships. I simply opened my personal savings and spent $195,000 of my own hard-earned money on structural repairs they never even noticed. I did it because I loved this building. I did it because I thought if I fixed enough broken things, eventually, they would stop seeing me as the broken one. But sitting there, listening to the hum of the air conditioner I had repaired last July, I realized my compassion had been a luxury they had overextended for years. I had been living under the survivor's invisible chain. It is a psychological trap where you keep performing, keep overachieving, and keep sacrificing just to prove you are worthy of a seat at the table. You stay silent when they insult your profession, because you think your silence is a down payment on their eventual love. You think that if you are indispensable, you will finally be seen, but that is the lie of the scapegoat. The more you give, the more they believe you have nothing left to lose. Lauren smirked at me, her Yale law degree practically glowing in her eyes, and said that business has no room for sentiment. She told me Grandma Evelyn would have wanted the asset to reach its full potential. At our family dinners, the air usually smelled like expensive wine, and a very specific kind of silence. It was the silence of Susan and Robert ignoring my updates about the building's boiler system to ask Lauren about her latest partnership track. They practiced a subtle form of gaslighting that was as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. They would tell me they were proud of my work ethic, then in the next breath, ask if I needed a loan to buy a real suit. They made sure I knew I was a phase, not a future. They believed I was the help because I was willing to do the help's work. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single drop of regret or a feeling of betrayal, but there was only a balance sheet. I had paid the property taxes when they were on the edge of foreclosure 3 years ago. I had managed the elderly residents like they were my own blood, while Lauren barely visited Evelyn on her deathbed. Now, I looked at the 3 people standing in my kitchen and realized the debt had been called in. This was not a breakdown, this was accounting. They were not shocked by what they were doing to me. They were just going to be shocked when I stopped playing the part of the grateful, quiet daughter. The game had shifted, and for the first time in my life, I was the only one who knew the true value of the board. I walked away from their smirks without saying a word and headed down to my basement workshop. The air down there always changed, shifting from the sterile, expensive scent of my mother's perfume to the honest, heavy smells of limestone, damp earth, and machine oil. In this building, the basement is not just a storage space. It is the skeleton that holds up the history of Beacon Hill. I reached for the heavy iron cabinet in the corner, the one Lauren always called an eyesore, and pulled out the original structural blueprints of the Somerset Heights. I unrolled them across my workbench, the heavy paper crinkling like a warning. Lauren thinks power is a Yale law degree and a sharp suit, but as a conservation engineer, I know the real laws of this world are gravity and structural integrity. You can lie to a judge, but you can never lie to a load-bearing wall. As I traced the lines of the foundation with my fingers, My eyes caught a stack of manila envelopes sitting near the service entrance mail that had been diverted from the residence boxes. My heart did not skip a beat, it simply stilled into a clinical rhythm. I opened the top one, and saw the letterhead of Lauren's law firm. These were not just rent increases, they were pre-eviction notices, disguised as a notice of structural intent. Lauren was already moving to clear the building. She was targeting the third floor first, Mrs. Rodriguez and her granddaughter, the ones she had walked past without a glance just hours ago. The letter stated that due to suspected masonry failure, the units had to be vacated within 30 days. It was a lie. I had personally reinforced those specific masonry ties 2 summers ago, with 3 inches of steel and $2,000 worth of specialized epoxy. I sat back on my stool and looked at the blueprints, seeing the building for what it actually was, a puzzle Grandma Evelyn had left specifically for me to solve. Lauren's plan was a Phase 1 clearance for Apex Development, a name I saw scribbled in the margins of a draft agreement she had carelessly left behind in her rush to celebrate. She was planning to sell the Somerset Heights for $25 million, turning these homes into luxury condos that would sit empty as tax shelters for offshore investors. She saw residents as obstacles, as numbers on a spreadsheet that needed to be zeroed out. She didn't realize that in her arrogance, she had ignored the most basic rule of engineering. Before you try to tear down a structure, you should always check who holds the deed to the foundation. The ink beneath my fingernails felt like fire now. I wasn't going to fight her with screams or tears. I was going to fight her with the very thing she worshipped, the fine print. I reached for my phone and dialed the number Grandma had written in the back of her old ledger, the one for Howard Dade. This wasn't a family feud anymore, it was a structural collapse, and I was the only one who knew how to guide the wreckage. The rain was a cold, rhythmic drumming on the roof of my car as I sat outside a small cafe in southeast Boston, nursing the weight of Grandma Evelyn's secrets. Across from me, Howard Dade looked less like the high-powered attorney I had expected, and more like a man who spent his weekends pruning roses and reading history. He wore a well-worn cardigan that smelled faintly of old books and was nursing a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. He was a relic of an era where a person's word was a structural support, and their signature was the final coat of paint. "Your grandmother was one of the sharpest clients I ever had," Howard said, his voice a low gravel that cut through the hiss of the espresso machine. "She came to me 3 years ago, convinced that your sister's ambition would eventually become a demolition crew for the family legacy." He pulled a thick folder from his briefcase, the paper yellowed at the edges but the contents lethal. He didn't waste time on small talk. He moved straight to the data, the way an engineer looks for a stress fracture. He slid a document across the table. It was the ownership structure for the Somerset Heights. On paper, the family trust managed by Lauren owned the building. That was the surface. That was the facade Lauren was acting on. But beneath that facade, the ownership had been transferred to a limited liability company called Summit Ivy Holdings exactly 3 years ago. The trust was merely a management shell. It didn't own the bricks. It didn't own the air. And Summit Ivy Holdings had one sole owner, Maya Elizabeth Maddox. "I never signed for this," I whispered, staring at my own name printed in black and white. "I would have remembered." Howard's eyes crinkled with a knowing amusement that reminded me so much of Evelyn. "You signed what you thought were routine management updates. Page 47 of your employment contract, to be specific. Every signature was witnessed. Every document was notarized." Evelyn was very thorough. As I sat there, the shock did not manifest as a heartbeat. It was a shift in my internal architecture. I had owned this building for 3 years. While Lauren was treating me like a servant, I was technically her employer. While my parents were debating the fairness of $12,800, they were debating the value of a property they no longer controlled. Howard leaned back and pointed to a specific paragraph in the management agreement. Section 15.3.2. He called it the Greed Clause. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering. It stated that the management rights of the trust would be automatically terminated, without notice, upon any attempt to raise rents by more than 10% without the documented approval of the owner. By tripling my rent to $12,800, Lauren hadn't just made a mistake. She had automatically fired herself from her position as manager. I pulled out my digital engineering logs, thousands of pages of data I had recorded over the years. This was my empowerment arc. Lauren's lawyers had sent letters claiming masonry failure and safety hazards, using their law degrees like blunt instruments to intimidate the vulnerable. But I had the measurements of every vibration in that building. I had the chemical analysis of the mortar. I had the thermal imaging of the walls. Her legal rhetoric was just ink on a page, but my data was the reality of the stone itself. Lauren had built a case on the assumption that I was a phase, someone who was too emotional or too simple to understand the real world of business. But business is just another structure. And I am an engineer. I knew that while Lauren was out playing the shark, she had forgotten to check the depth of the water. She had walked into a trap Evelyn had spent years building. And I was the only one with the key to the exit. I didn't feel triumph yet. I felt the cold, heavy weight of responsibility. This was the turning point where the spare daughter became the sovereign and the golden child became a tenant without a lease. Howard and I did not stop at the ownership of the bricks. We went deeper into the plumbing of the building's finances. For 2 weeks, I lived in a world of ledgers and bank statements, tracing the flow of money like I was tracking a leak in an old pipe. What I found was a rot far more extensive than a few inflated rent notices. Lauren had been using the Somerset Heights as her personal automated teller machine for years. The systematic audit revealed a series of payments to a vendor called Somerset Restoration Services. On paper, they were hired for a massive emergency roof overhaul 2 years ago. The total was exactly $195,000, the same amount I had painstakingly saved and spent from my own pocket to keep the building from collapsing while Lauren was busy elsewhere. I checked the registration for Somerset Restoration Services. It was a shell company, incorporated in Delaware just 3 days before the first check was cut, with a mailing address that traced back to a post office box Lauren owned. She hadn't just been negligent. She had been robbing the legacy she claimed to be protecting. She was siphoning off the building's emergency funds while I was in the basement, literally covered in dust and mortar, trying to keep the walls from bowing. But the financial theft was not the kill shot. The final piece of the puzzle came from a small, digital voice recorder I found tucked into the back of Evelyn's old Singer sewing machine in the storage unit. I sat on my workbench and pressed play. The recording was dated 2 weeks before Grandma Evelyn passed away. The background was the steady, rhythmic beep of a hospice heart monitor. I heard Lauren's voice, not the polished, professional tone she used in courtrooms, but something jagged and predatory. She was pressuring Evelyn, who sounded groggy and confused on high-dose morphine, to sign a limited power of attorney for the development rights. "Just sign it, Grandma," Lauren's voice hissed through the speaker. "Maya can't handle this. She's just a manager. She doesn't understand the value. This is for the family." I heard the sound of paper rustling, and Evelyn's weak, labored breath as she tried to refuse, her voice a mere shadow of the woman who had raised me. Lauren didn't stop. She kept pushing, using the same business necessity rhetoric she had used on me while her own grandmother was fading away. Listening to it, I didn't feel the urge to cry. I felt a sudden, profound stillness. This wasn't just a family disagreement about money or a difference in vision for a building. This was a criminal enterprise built on the exploitation of a dying woman. Lauren wasn't just an arrogant sister. She was a predator who had forged the path to her own success with the stolen pieces of our history. I turned off the recorder and looked at the blueprints again. Lauren was planning a board meeting for tomorrow to finalize the sale to Apex Development for $25 million. She thought she was about to walk away with a fortune while I was left with an eviction notice. She had no idea that I wasn't just holding the data on the masonry anymore. I had the data on her soul. This wasn't revenge. It was an audit of her entire life, and the balance was about to come due. The board meeting was held in the grand foyer of the Somerset Heights, a space that smelled of polished mahogany, expensive lilies, and a very specific kind of arrogance. Lauren sat at the head of the antique conference table, looking like a shark in Italian wool. My parents, Robert and Susan, sat on either side of her, their faces illuminated by the glow of the gold pens they were prepared to use to sign away $25 million worth of history. Across from them sat the representatives from Apex Development, checking their watches with the practiced boredom of men who bought and sold people's lives for breakfast. I didn't knock. I didn't wait for an invitation. I simply walked into the room with Howard Dade behind me, the sound of my work boots a jarring, heavy rhythm against the silence. Lauren looked up, her eyes narrowing with the same disdain she used for a smudge on her windshield. She told me the meeting was for board members only, and that I should go back to the basement to check the boiler. I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. I walked straight to the center of the table and placed a thick, bound folder in front of the lead developer from Apex. I told them they were wasting their time because the person they were negotiating with had no legal authority to sell the bricks beneath their feet. Lauren laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the historic masonry. She told the developers, I was a disgruntled manager who was having a breakdown over a rent increase. But the laughter died the moment Howard Dade stepped forward and placed the ownership deed for Summit Ivy Holdings on the table. I watched the blood drain from Lauren's face as she read my name, Maya Elizabeth Maddox, listed as the sole proprietor. I looked at my parents. They weren't looking at me with pride or even confusion. They were staring at the documents with a growing, frantic horror. For them, this wasn't about the building, it was about the $25 million that was suddenly evaporating. This was where I saw the illusion of power from an empty wallet. I realized in that moment that Robert and Susan didn't actually have a personality or a moral code. They had a status that was entirely rented through Lauren's success. Now that the money was gone, they looked hollowed out. They didn't look like parents losing a daughter. They looked like investors who had just realized their entire portfolio was a scam. Their position in the Boston elite was a facade, and I was the one pulling down the scaffolding. I turned back to Lauren and spoke with the cold precision of a structural report. I told her that according to Section 15.3.2 of the management agreement, she had automatically terminated her own rights the second she attempted to raise my rent by 300% without my approval. She wasn't the manager anymore. She wasn't the golden child. She was just a person standing in a room she didn't own. Then, I played the recording from the hospice room. Evelyn's weak, struggling voice and Lauren's predatory hissing filled the foyer, stripping away every last layer of her professional reputation. The Apex developers stood up and walked out without a word, their silence a lethal judgment. Seconds later, the heavy brass doors of the Somerset opened, and 3 officers from the state attorney's office entered. I handed Lauren the criminal warrant for elder abuse, forgery, and the embezzlement of $195,000. I told her I had already audited her shell companies and that the state had everything they needed. As they led her away in handcuffs, she screamed that I had ruined the family. I simply looked at the load-bearing walls Grandma Evelyn had entrusted to me and realized that for the first time in 60 years, the foundation of this building was finally clear of rot. Lauren's sentencing took place on a gray Tuesday morning that felt less like a victory and more like the final inspection of a collapsed structure. The judge, a woman with eyes as sharp as an architect's level, did not show mercy for Lauren's professional record. She saw the forgery, she saw the elder abuse, she saw the systematic theft from people who had no one else to protect them. She gave Lauren 10 years in state prison with a possibility of parole after 7. She was ordered to pay full restitution of $92,000 to the building, though we all knew the total Lauren had siphoned was closer to $200,000. Most importantly, Lauren was permanently disbarred. The law degree she had used as a weapon was officially revoked. I watched as the officers led her away, her orange jumpsuit a jarring, neon scar against the historic Beacon Hill limestone of the courthouse. My parents, Robert and Susan, stood in the hallway afterward, looking like people who had suddenly realized they were standing in a house they couldn't afford. They had backed the wrong daughter, and in their pursuit of a $25 million payout, they had lost their retirement, their status, and their family. Dad told me they hadn't known about the theft, that they were just following Lauren's lead. I told him that they hadn't wanted to know. It was easier to believe I was a jealous failure than to believe their golden child was a criminal. My door was open, I told them, but only if they were willing to walk through it as people, not as investors. 6 months later, I stood in the foyer of the Somerset Heights with Howard Dade and signed the final deed transfer papers. I wasn't keeping the $25 million asset for myself. I was placing the Somerset Heights into a community land trust. It would remain affordable housing in perpetuity, managed by a board of residents and local advocates. I would stay on as the head engineer and manager, but I no longer worked for the profit of a family trust. I worked for the community. Mrs. Rodriguez wouldn't have to worry about a Phase 1 clearance ever again. Mr. Petrov could keep his chess club in the foyer. The foundation was finally secure, not just with steel and epoxy, but with the law. I went up to the rooftop garden that evening, the one Grandma Evelyn had tended until her hands were too weak to hold the shears. The ivy she loved was still climbing, its strong roots woven deep into the stone. I pulled out a letter that had arrived from the prison that morning. It was from Lauren. She wrote that she still thought I was a fool for giving away $12 million in equity. She said she might never understand why I chose the residence over the money. But then she added that Susan had visited her, and for the first time in years, our mother wasn't talking about designer bags or country clubs, she was talking about Evelyn. I looked out over the Boston skyline, feeling the quiet, heavy peace of a job finished. Grandma Evelyn's favorite quote was framed in my office now, the words cross-stitched and weathered. We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. Lauren had spent her life trying to get, and she had ended up with a decade of silence. I had spent my life giving to this building, and in return, it had given me a home that could never be appraised. I stood there for a long time, watching the lights flicker on in the apartments below. The families were sitting down to dinner. The hallways were filled with the sounds of lives being lived without the threat of a tripling rent or a manufactured health code violation. I walked back inside, checked the lock on the service door one last time, and headed to my unit. I didn't feel like the spare daughter anymore. I felt like the architect of my own peace. The debt was paid, the audit was closed, and for the first time in 34 years, I slept through until morning. If you believe that home means more than equity, and that everyone deserves a safe place to live, hit the like button, and subscribe for more stories of justice. Share this to remind everyone that some legacies are not for sale.